9-year-old boy watches his father die. Poison, most likely, slipped into his cup by enemies who knew exactly what they were doing. The father had been a minor chieftain, barely significant in the vast sweep of the Mongolian steppes, but his death would matter. The boy's name was Temüjin. Within 40 years, he would be called something else entirely, a title that would echo through 8 centuries of human history: Genghis Khan. Most people know the ending of this story: an empire stretching from Korea to Hungary, the largest continuous land empire ever assembled. 20 million dead, perhaps more. The numbers blur into incomprehensibility. Cities reduced to rubble, civilizations rewritten, the genetic legacy of one man traceable in 16 million living descendants. But the beginning was different. The beginning was cold and hungry and impossibly small. After his father's death, Temüjin's own clan abandoned him. His mother, his siblings, all left to starve on the steppes because a family without a patriarch was considered worthless. They survived on wild onions, fish, and marmots. This was not the childhood of a conqueror. This was the childhood of someone learning what it meant to be erased. How does a boy with nothing become a man who reshapes the world? How does abandonment become ambition? How does hunger become empire? This is not a story about destiny. This is a story about decisions made in darkness, alliances forged in desperation, and violence so calculated it changed the grammar of warfare itself. It's a story about what happens when someone refuses to accept the world as it is. To understand Temüjin, you have to understand the world that made him. And that world was the Mongolian steppes in the 12th century, a landscape so harsh it seemed designed to break people. The steppes are grasslands, vast and flat, stretching from Manchuria to Hungary. In winter, temperatures drop to 40 below zero. In summer, the sun bakes the earth until it cracks. Trees are rare, water is scarce, the wind never stops. The people who lived there, Mongols, Tatars, Merkits, Kerites, dozens of tribes, were nomads. They lived in felt tents called gers, circular structures that could be assembled or dismantled in less than an hour. They followed their herds, sheep, goats, horses, cattle, moving with the seasons. Everything they owned had to be portable. Survival depended on cooperation, but cooperation was temporary. Clans formed alliances when it suited them and dissolved those alliances when it didn't. Blood feuds could span generations. A slight against your grandfather might justify killing someone's son. There was no central authority, no king, no emperor, no code of law that everyone followed. Power belonged to whoever could take it and hold it. Chieftains rose and fell based on their ability to provide food, protection, horses. If you couldn't provide, your followers left. Simple as that. The Mongols worshipped Tengri, the eternal blue sky. They believed the sky watched everything, that it granted fortune to the brave and punishment to the cowardly. Shamans interpreted omens, the flight of birds, the patterns in bones after they were burned. Religion wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into every decision. Horses were everything. A Mongol learned to ride before they learned to walk. The horses were small, stocky, capable of surviving on almost nothing, grass in summer, scraping through snow for dried forage in winter. A warrior might own 10 or 15 horses, rotating them to keep them fresh during long rides. If you lost your horses, you lost your mobility, and if you lost your mobility, you died. Raids were constant. One clan would attack another to steal horses, women, or supplies. Revenge raids followed, then revenge for the revenge. Violence was cyclical, inherited, inescapable. Into this world, Temüjin was born around 1162 AD. His father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, not insignificant, but far from powerful. Yesugei had kidnapped Temüjin's mother, Hoelun, from another man, a rival tribesman. This was not unusual. This was how marriages often began on the steppes. Legend says, Temüjin was born clutching a blood clot in his fist, a sign, the shamans claimed, that he would become a great warrior. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's a story invented later to justify what came after. Either way, his childhood was unremarkable until it wasn't. When Temüjin was 9, his father took him to find a bride. This was standard practice, arranging marriages between clans to strengthen alliances. They traveled to the Ongirat tribe, where Yesugei had friends. There, Temüjin met Berta, a girl slightly older than him. She was smart, confident, unafraid. Her father agreed to the engagement. Yesugei left Temüjin with Berta's family, another standard practice, allowing the boy to prove himself useful to his future in-laws. Then Yesugei began the journey home. He never made it. On the way back, Yesugei encountered a group of Tatars, a rival tribe. Years earlier, Yesugei had killed some of their kinsmen. The Tatars recognized him. They invited him to share a meal. Hospitality was sacred on the steppes, but so was revenge. They poisoned his food. Yesugei made it home, but barely. He lingered for a few days, long enough to send for Temüjin. By the time the boy arrived, his father was dead. Temüjin was now the head of his family, but he was 9 years old. And on the steppes, a family led by a child was no family at all. The Borjigin clan held a council after Yesugei's death. Temüjin's family attended, his mother Hoelun, his younger brothers Kasar, Temüge, and Belgute, his baby sister Temülen. They expected the clan to support them, to honor Yesugei's memory by caring for his widow and children. That's not what happened. The clan's elders announced they would no longer follow Hoelun. She had no husband, no adult sons, no way to lead or protect them. They were leaving, taking their herds, their tents, their people. Hoelun and her children were on their own. Hoelun tried to stop them. She mounted a horse, grabbed the clan's banner, a symbol of unity, and rode after them. She shouted, pleaded, reminded them of her husband's service. Some of the clan members wept as they left, but they still left. The family was alone. No herds, no followers, no protection. Just a widow, 5 children, and the endless steppe. They should have died. Most families in their position did die, from starvation, exposure, or attacks by other tribes. But Hoelun refused to let that happen. She taught her children to survive. They foraged for wild onions, lily bulbs, anything edible. They fished in the rivers using hooks made from bone. They hunted marmots, small rodents that burrowed in the grasslands. Temüjin and his brothers made bows from what little wood they could find. They learned to track, to wait, to kill. Hoelun held the family together through sheer force of will. She divided the labor. Some children foraged, others hunted. Everyone contributed. She told them stories of their father, of the clan they came from, of the lives they would reclaim. She refused to let them see themselves as victims. But survival came at a cost. Temüjin grew up hungry, humiliated, constantly aware that his family's suffering was someone else's choice. The clan that abandoned them still lived nearby. He could see their campfires at night. He knew they were eating meat while his family chewed roots. It's hard to say what that does to a child, but you can guess. Temüjin had a half-brother named Begta. Begta was older, from a different mother, one of Yesugei's other wives. Begta was stronger than Temüjin, more skilled at hunting. He often took more than his share of food. In a family barely surviving, this was unforgivable. One day, Temüjin and his brother Kasar killed Begta. They didn't do it in a fight. They hunted him like an animal. They approached from two directions while Begta sat on a hill. Begta saw them coming. He didn't run. Some sources say he just sat there and asked them not to harm their mother. Then they shot him with arrows. Hoelun was furious. She called Temüjin a monster, compared him to a wolf tearing apart its own pack. But she didn't banish him. She couldn't. The family needed him. What matters here is not whether Temüjin was justified. What matters is that he learned something crucial, that survival sometimes requires violence against your own, that mercy is a luxury you can't always afford, that the world will not save you if you won't save yourself. The Temüjin clan, a rival group, had been watching Temüjin's family. They saw the boy growing stronger, becoming a leader. They remembered his father Yesugei, remembered old feuds. They decided Temüjin needed to be eliminated before he became a threat. They raided Temüjin's camp and captured him. He was maybe 13 or 14 years old. They locked him in a wooden kang, a board clamped around his neck, so heavy he couldn't lift it. He was paraded through the Temüjin camps as a warning. This is what happens when you challenge us. Temüjin escaped. During a festival, when his captors were drunk and distracted, he knocked out his guard with the kang and ran. He hid in a river, submerged with only his face above water, while search parties passed overhead. A man from the Temüjin camp, someone who sympathized with him, found him and chose not to turn him in. That man hid Temüjin in a cart full of wool until the search ended. Then Temüjin returned to his family, bruised, humiliated, but alive. Two things came from this experience. First, Temüjin learned he could rely on unexpected allies, that loyalty sometimes came from surprising places. Second, he learned that his enemies would never stop hunting him unless he hunted them first. He was 16 when he went to reclaim Berta, the girl he'd been engaged 2 years before. Her family had waited, kept the arrangement intact despite everything. They married. Berta's dowry included a rare gift, a black sable coat. Temüjin would use that coat to begin building the alliances that would change everything. Temüjin understood something essential. He couldn't rise alone. The steppes didn't reward lone wolves. They rewarded leaders who could forge alliances, who could make others see value in following them. He took Berta's sable coat and traveled to meet Togrul, the Khan of the Karaites. Togrul was powerful, controlled thousands of warriors, vast herds, an entire network of clans. More importantly, Togrul had been friends with Temüjin's father years before. He had sworn an oath of brotherhood with Yesugei. Temüjin arrived at Togrul's camp, presented the sable coat, and asked to renew his father's alliance. He called Togrul father, invoking the bond of the past. Togrul accepted. This was Temüjin's first major alliance. It gave him legitimacy, protection, and access to resources he couldn't have dreamed of as a starving child. But alliances on the steppes were fragile. They lasted only as long as they benefited both sides. Shortly after his marriage, disaster struck. The Merkits, another tribe, raided Temüjin's camp. They were seeking revenge. Years earlier, Temüjin's father Yesugei had kidnapped Hoelun from a Merkit man. Now the Merkits came to balance the scales. They captured Berta. Temüjin, his brothers, and his mother escaped, barely. but Berta was taken. She was given to one of the Merkit warriors as a wife. Temüjin could have cut his losses. He could have remarried, moved on, accepted this as the brutal logic of steppe life. Instead, he did something remarkable. He went to Togrul and asked for help. Togrul agreed, but he made one condition. Temüjin had to bring another ally to the campaign. He needed to prove he could build his own network, not just rely on borrowed power. So Temüjin went to find Jamuka. Jamuka was his childhood friend, possibly his closest friend. They'd sworn brotherhood as boys, sharing blood and making oaths beneath the sky. But they'd drifted apart over the years. Jamuka had risen to become a minor chieftain, commanding his own warriors. Temüjin asked for his help, and Jamuka agreed. Together, Temüjin, Togrul, and Jamuka, they assembled a force of several thousand warriors. They rode against the Merkits in a coordinated attack. The Merkits were scattered, unprepared for such overwhelming force. They fled, abandoning their camps. Temüjin found Berta. She was pregnant. Months later, she gave birth to a son, Jochi. The name meant guest. No one knew for certain if the child was Temüjin's or the Merkit warriors. Temüjin chose to claim him as his own. This decision would echo for decades. Jochi would always carry the shadow of illegitimacy. His brothers would question his right to inherit, and Temüjin would spend years navigating the politics of succession. But in the short term, Temüjin had proven himself. He'd rescued his wife, defeated a powerful enemy, and forged alliances with two major leaders. Word spread across the steppes. This Borjigin boy, the one who'd been abandoned, was someone to watch. For a while, Temüjin and Jamuka traveled together. They renewed their brotherhood, shared resources, moved their camps in parallel. But the relationship was fragile. Jamuka was a traditionalist. He believed in the old ways, that clans should stay separate, that chieftains should come from noble bloodlines, that the social order was meant to be preserved. Temüjin believed something different. He believed in merit. He promoted men based on loyalty and skill, not birth. He welcomed outcasts, former enemies, anyone willing to follow him. Followers began to choose sides. Some clans joined Jamuka, drawn to his respect for tradition. But others joined Temüjin, those who saw him as offering something new, a chance to rise regardless of where you started. The breaking point came during a hunt. Some of Jamuka's men stole horses from Temüjin's followers. Temüjin's people retaliated, killing one of the thieves. Jamuka saw this as an insult. Temüjin saw it as justice. The two friends became enemies. Jamuka gathered an army, 30,000 warriors from various clans who feared Temüjin's growing influence. He marched against Temüjin in what would later be called the Battle of Dalan Baljut. Temüjin's forces were vastly outnumbered. He lost. Jamuka's victory was brutal. He captured several of Temüjin's allies and executed them by boiling them alive in 70 cauldrons. This was meant to humiliate Temüjin, to show the cost of following him. But it backfired. Many clans were horrified by Jamuka's cruelty. Even some of his own followers began to question him. Temüjin, by contrast, treated captives with calculated mercy. He gave them a choice: join him or leave in peace. More and more clans chose to join him. In 1186 AD, a gathering of Mongol clans declared Temüjin their Khan. He was maybe 24 years old. He now commanded thousands of warriors, controlled vast territories, and had a reputation as both a fierce warrior and a fair leader. But he was still far from uniting the Mongols. and the steppes were about to become even more dangerous. Being declared Khan was one thing, holding power was another. Temüjin ruled a fragile coalition, clans that could abandon him at any moment if he showed weakness. He needed to prove himself indispensable. He began by reorganizing his army. This was revolutionary. Most Mongol forces were organized by clan. You fought alongside your relatives, your tribesmen. Temüjin broke that structure. He divided his army into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. These units mixed warriors from different clans. A man's loyalty was no longer to his tribe, it was to his unit, and through that, to Temüjin. Officers were chosen based on skill, not lineage. A commoner could command 1,000 men if he proved capable. This shattered traditional hierarchies. It made Temüjin's army meritocratic in a world built on inherited privilege. And it worked. He also implemented strict discipline. Looting during battle was forbidden until victory was secured. Desertion was punished by death, but loyalty was rewarded generously. Captured loot was distributed fairly, with officers receiving larger shares. If a unit performed well, every member benefited. This created a culture where warriors fought not just for survival, but for advancement. Temüjin developed a new approach to warfare. Traditional steppe battles were chaotic, mounted warriors charging, retreating, skirmishing. Temüjin imposed order. His armies used coordinated tactics. Units communicated using flags and drums. They executed false retreats, luring enemies into pursuing what seemed like a fleeing force, only to turn and encircle them. They used scouts extensively, gathering intelligence before engaging. And they moved fast, incredibly fast. A Mongol warrior could cover more than 100 miles in a single day. This was possible because each warrior had multiple horses. They rotated mounts to keep them fresh, sometimes riding one horse while leading several others. This mobility allowed them to appear where enemies didn't expect, to strike before defenses could be organized. Temüjin also mastered the art of psychological warfare. He understood that fear could be more powerful than force. When he conquered a clan, he offered the survivors a choice: join him or die. Those who joined were treated well, integrated into his army. Those who resisted were annihilated, entire clans wiped out as a warning to others. Word spread. When Temüjin's army approached, many clans surrendered without a fight. Why risk destruction when cooperation meant survival and even prosperity? But Temüjin's rise was not unopposed. The more powerful he became, the more threatened his rivals felt. In the mid-11th 90s, the Jin dynasty, the ruling power in northern China, decided to meddle in Mongol affairs. The Jin saw the Mongols as useful barbarians who could be manipulated to fight each other. They offered Temüjin a title and recognition if he would help them attack the Tatars. The Tatars, remember, were the tribe that had poisoned Temüjin's father years before. Temüjin agreed, not because he cared about the Jin, but because he wanted revenge. He and Togrul, his ally, the Karaite Khan, combined forces and attacked the Tatars. The campaign was brutal. Temüjin ordered that every Tatar male taller than a cart axle be killed. This effectively meant every man and adolescent boy. Thousands died. The Tatar tribe was shattered, absorbed into Temüjin's growing confederation. The Jin rewarded Temüjin with a minor title, something meaningless to him. But the campaign gave him something far more valuable: credibility. He had destroyed one of the most powerful tribes on the steppes, and he had proven he could work with foreign powers when it suited him. Around this time, Temüjin's relationship with Togrul began to fracture. Togrul's son, Sengum, was jealous of Temüjin's rising power. He convinced his father that Temüjin was becoming too ambitious, that he would eventually challenge the Karaites for supremacy. Togrul invited Temüjin to a supposed marriage negotiation, a trap. But Temüjin learned of the plan and didn't show up. Instead, he launched a preemptive strike. The war between Temüjin and Togrul lasted several years. It was brutal, personal, and devastating for both sides. At one point, Temüjin was so outnumbered he had to retreat with only a handful of followers. He hid near a lake called Baljuna, regrouping with just 19 loyal men. They drank muddy water and swore an oath, the Baljuna Covenant. They pledged loyalty to each other, to Temüjin, to the vision of a united Mongol nation. These 19 men would become the core of Temüjin's inner circle. Slowly, Temüjin rebuilt his forces. Clans that had abandoned him returned, drawn by his reputation for resilience. He launched a surprise attack on Togrul's camp. The Karaites were caught off guard. Togrul fled and was killed by Naimans, yet another rival tribe, who didn't recognize him. The Karaite Confederation collapsed. Temüjin absorbed their warriors, their resources, their territory. Now he controlled most of central Mongolia, but two major rivals remained, the Naimans in the west and Jamukha, his former friend, who continued to oppose him. By the early 1200s, the steppes were fracturing along a single fault line. On one side stood Temüjin, disciplined, meritocratic, relentless. On the other stood everyone who feared what he represented. The Naimans, led by Tayang Khan, formed the last major coalition against Temüjin. They allied with remnants of the Merkits, the Tatars, and various smaller clans. Jamukha joined them. This was the final test. If Temüjin lost, he would be destroyed, his family killed, his vision erased. If he won, nothing would stand between him and total control of Mongolia. The two armies met at Chakamot, near the Altai Mountains, in 1204 AD. The Naiman forces were confident. They outnumbered Temüjin's army and held strong defensive positions. Tayang Khan believed victory was inevitable. He was wrong. Temüjin used a tactic that would become legendary. He ordered his troops to light extra campfires at night, creating the illusion of a much larger force. The Naimans saw the fires and assumed they were surrounded. Panic spread through their ranks. When the battle began, Temüjin's disciplined units moved in perfect coordination. They executed feigned retreats, drawing the Naimans out of position. Then they turned and struck with devastating precision. The Naiman army shattered. Tayang Khan was killed in the chaos. His son fled with the remnants of the army, but was hunted down and executed. Jamukha, seeing the battle was lost, fled into the mountains. But his own men betrayed him. They bound him and brought him to Temüjin, hoping for a reward. Temüjin had them executed. He told his followers that anyone who would betray their Khan was unworthy of life. This was theatre, a message about loyalty. Then he turned to Jamukha. They had been friends once, brothers by oath. Temüjin offered to renew that brotherhood, to forgive the years of conflict. Jamukha refused. He said that two suns could not exist in the same sky. He asked for an honorable death. Temüjin granted it. Jamukha was executed without shedding his blood, wrapped in a carpet and crushed, a death reserved for nobles. Some sources say Temüjin wept. With Jamukha's death, the last major opposition to Temüjin collapsed. The Mongolian steppes, dozens of tribes, centuries of division, were unified under one leader. In 1206 AD, a grand assembly was called, a Kurultai. Chieftains from across Mongolia gathered near the Onon River. They raised a white banner, the symbol of supreme authority, and they proclaimed Temüjin the great Khan of all Mongols. He took a new name, Genghis Khan. The name's meaning is debated. Some say it means universal ruler. Others say it means oceanic, as vast as the sea. Either way, it was a declaration. This man, born into poverty and abandonment, now claimed dominion over an entire people. But Genghis Khan didn't just want to rule the Mongols. He wanted to reshape the world. And he understood that unification was only the beginning. He codified laws, the yasa. These were practical rules designed to hold the empire together. Theft was punishable by death. So was adultery. So was lying. But the yasa also promoted meritocracy. Religious tolerance was mandated. Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, shamans, all were protected under Mongol law. Widows and orphans were given special protections. And perhaps most radical, anyone, regardless of birth, could rise to positions of power if they proved capable. Genghis created a new aristocracy, not based on blood, but on loyalty and achievement. Men who had been shepherds or blacksmiths became generals. Former enemies who submitted were given command positions. This wasn't idealism. This was pragmatism. Genghis understood that an empire built on traditional hierarchies would fracture along tribal lines. But an empire where anyone could succeed, that empire would be bound by ambition, not just fear. He also established the Keshig, an elite guard of 10,000 warriors. These were the best fighters, the most loyal men, drawn from every tribe. They served as both bodyguards and administrators, and they were held to impossibly high standards. Failure meant death, but success meant wealth and prestige. With the Mongols unified, Genghis turned his attention outward. The steppes were secure. Now he would test his army against the great powers of the age. The Jin dynasty controlled northern China. They were powerful, wealthy, and deeply contemptuous of the Mongols. To the Jin, the Mongols were barbarians, useful occasionally for fighting other barbarians, but nothing more. Genghis had dealt with the Jin before. They'd given him a minor title years earlier, a meaningless gesture meant to keep him compliant. Now he was no longer interested in titles. In 1209 AD, the Jin emperor died. His successor demanded that Genghis kowtow, perform a ritual of submission. Genghis refused. He spat on the ground and said he would never bow to a weakling. Then he returned to Mongolia and began preparing for war. The Jin expected a typical steppe raid. Mongols attacking border towns, stealing what they could, then retreating before a real army could respond. But Genghis wasn't leading a raid. He was leading an invasion. In 1211 AD, Genghis led his army across the Gobi Desert and into Jin territory. The Jin had fortifications, massive walls, well-defended cities, garrisons of trained soldiers. The Mongols had none of these advantages. But they had speed, and they had terror. Mongol cavalry swept through the countryside, destroying everything in their path. Villages were burned, crops seized, populations massacred or enslaved. Jin armies tried to engage them in open battle, but the Mongols refused to fight on their terms. They used hit-and-run tactics, appearing suddenly, striking hard, then vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. When the Mongols encountered walled cities, they adapted. They had no experience with siege warfare. Nomads didn't build walls, so they'd never needed to tear them down. But Genghis was pragmatic. He recruited Chinese engineers who had defected or been captured. They taught the Mongols how to build siege engines, catapults, battering rams, towers. The first few sieges were clumsy, inefficient, but Genghis learned quickly. Within months, his army was tearing down walls that had stood for centuries. The psychological warfare was calculated. When a city resisted, Genghis offered terms: surrender now and be spared. Refuse, and everyone dies. Cities that surrendered were usually treated well, their people left alive, their properties largely intact. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Word spread. Entire regions surrendered without fighting. Why risk total destruction when submission meant survival? By 1213 AD, the Mongols had devastated much of northern China. The Jin emperor retreated south to Kaifeng, abandoning his northern capital. Genghis laid siege to Beijing, then called Zhengdu. The siege lasted more than a year. Beijing was one of the most fortified cities in the world. Massive walls, deep moats, hundreds of thousands of defenders. But Genghis was patient. He cut off supply lines, starved the population, launched relentless assaults. In 1215 AD, Beijing fell. The Mongols burned it for weeks. The fires were visible for miles. Smoke darkened the sky. But Genghis didn't stay to occupy China. He wasn't interested in ruling sedentary civilizations, not yet. He extracted tribute, installed puppet governors, and withdrew. The Jin dynasty was crippled, but not destroyed. That would come later. The campaign against the Jin established patterns that would define Mongol warfare for decades. Speed, terror, adaptability, mercy for those who submitted, annihilation for those who resisted, and an absolute willingness to learn from enemies, to adopt their technologies, their tactics, their knowledge. Genghis was now in his 50s. He had gone from abandoned child to ruler of the largest army in Asia. But he wasn't done. While Genghis fought the Jin, events were unfolding far to the west. The Khwarezmian Empire stretched from Persia to Central Asia, a vast, wealthy realm controlling the Silk Road. Its ruler, Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, was powerful and arrogant. Genghis sent envoys to the Khwarezmian capital. The message was straightforward: let's trade. Genghis wanted access to Silk Road commerce, wanted diplomatic relations. The Shah agreed. In 1218 AD, a Mongol trade caravan, 450 merchants, arrived at the Khwarezmian city of Otrar. The governor of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, accused the merchants of being spies. He had them arrested, then he had them executed, and he seized all their goods. Genghis sent more envoys, this time demanding justice. He wanted Inalchuk punished, wanted compensation for the lost merchants. The Shah's response was catastrophic. He had the lead envoy killed, and he had the beards of the other envoys shaved off, a profound insult in Mongol culture. Then he sent them back. Genghis Khan went to a mountaintop alone. He prayed to Tengri for 3 days. When he came down, he declared war. In 1219 AD, Genghis assembled an army of over 100,000 warriors. He divided them into multiple columns and marched west across deserts and mountains that most people considered impassable. The Khwarezmian Shah had a larger army, perhaps 400,000 soldiers, but those soldiers were scattered across dozens of cities. The Shah believed the Mongols would attack predictably along established routes. They didn't. The Mongols moved through terrain no one expected an army to cross. They appeared at cities that thought they had months to prepare. Before the Shah could concentrate his forces, the Mongols had already captured key positions. The city of Bukhara fell first. When Genghis entered the central mosque, he supposedly climbed onto the pulpit and told the assembled population that he was the punishment of God. If they had not sinned, he said, God would not have sent him. Bukhara was looted, burned, its population enslaved or killed. The great libraries, repositories of centuries of Islamic scholarship, were destroyed. Books were used as kindling or tossed into rivers. Then came Samarkand, one of the jewels of Central Asia, a city of 500,000 people. The Mongols surrounded it with over 100,000 troops. Genghis offered the same terms as always: surrender or die. The garrison tried to fight. They lasted 5 days. When the city fell, Genghis ordered the population assembled outside the walls. He separated the artisans, the skilled craftsmen, engineers, scribes, and sent them back to Mongolia. The rest were killed. Estimates vary wildly. Some sources claim tens of thousands died. Others claim hundreds of thousands. The exact numbers are impossible to verify, but the scale was undeniably massive. The Shah fled. He abandoned his empire, his armies, his family. Genghis sent 2 of his best generals, Jebe and Subutai, to hunt him down. What followed was one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history. Jebe and Subutai led 20,000 cavalry on a chase that covered thousands of miles. They pursued the Shah across Persia, destroying everything in their path. Cities that refused to help hunt the Shah were razed. The Shah eventually died on an island in the Caspian Sea, sick, hunted, broken. But Jebe and Subutai didn't stop. They continued westward, raiding into the Caucasus, defeating Georgian armies, circling north toward Russia. Meanwhile, Genghis dealt with the rest of the Khwarezmian Empire. He sent his sons to conquer different regions. His third son, Urgedai, captured the city of Urgenk after a brutal siege. The city's irrigation canals were destroyed, its fields flooded, its population massacred. Urgenk would never recover. Genghis personally led the assault on Otrar, the city where the caravan had been killed. The governor, Inalchuk, held out for months. When the city finally fell, Genghis had molten silver poured into Inalchuk's eyes and ears. Revenge was methodical, personal. The Khwarezmian campaign lasted 4 years. By its end, one of the world's great empires had been obliterated. Cities that had stood for centuries were ruins. The Silk Road, the artery of trade between East and West, was under Mongol control. Historians estimate that millions died. Some regions lost more than half their population. Agricultural systems collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Entire cultures were erased. But Genghis wasn't motivated by sadism. He was motivated by strategy. Every act of violence served a purpose: to terrify future enemies into surrendering without a fight. And it worked. By the time Genghis returned to Mongolia in 1223 AD, his reputation had spread across 2 continents. He was no longer just a steppe warlord. He was a force of nature. Conquest was only part of the story. What made Genghis Khan exceptional wasn't just his ability to destroy, it was his ability to build. The Mongol Empire at its height would become the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But empires that large don't hold together through force alone. They need systems, infrastructure, ideas. Genghis created something called the Yam, a postal relay system. Stations were built every 20 or 30 miles across the empire. Messengers could change horses at each station, allowing them to cover over 200 miles in a single day. This was faster than any communication system in the world at the time. Orders could be sent from Mongolia to Persia in weeks. Intelligence flowed constantly. Genghis knew what was happening in distant provinces almost as soon as his governors did. This allowed him to respond to threats, coordinate campaigns, and maintain control over vast distances. The Yam also facilitated trade. Merchants could travel across the empire with relative safety. The Mongols established a passport system, metal tablets that granted travelers protection. Attacking someone with a Mongol passport meant death. Trade flourished. Silk, spices, precious metals, ideas, all moved more freely than they had in centuries. A merchant could travel from Venice to Beijing under the protection of a single authority. This was unprecedented. Genghis also implemented a radical policy of religious tolerance. This wasn't born from enlightenment, it was pragmatic. His empire included Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Taoists, shamans. Trying to impose a single religion would have sparked endless rebellions. So he mandated tolerance. All religions were protected under Mongol law. Religious leaders were exempt from taxes. Churches, mosques, temples, all were left untouched unless they actively resisted Mongol rule. This policy had profound effects. It reduced internal conflict, made conquered populations more compliant, and attracted scholars and holy men from across the world. Karakorum, the Mongol capital, became a cosmopolitan city where Christian priests debated Muslim clerics while Buddhist monks meditated nearby. Genghis was also obsessed with meritocracy. He promoted based on ability, not birth. Some of his greatest generals came from humble backgrounds. Subutai, for example, was the son of a blacksmith. He became one of the greatest military commanders in history, leading campaigns from China to Hungary. Genghis valued loyalty and skill above everything else. If you were competent and loyal, you could rise to the highest ranks. But betrayal was met with absolute brutality. Genghis never forgot a slight, never forgave a traitor. Those who broke their oaths were hunted down, sometimes years later, and executed publicly. The Mongol legal code, the Yasa, was enforced ruthlessly. Theft meant death. Adultery meant death. Lying to a superior meant death. The punishments seemed draconian, but they created a society where crime was rare and order was maintained. Genghis also understood the value of knowledge. The Mongols had no written language of their own, so Genghis adopted the Uyghur script and mandated literacy among the elite. He brought scribes, scholars, and administrators from conquered territories to teach his people. He was fascinated by other cultures. He invited philosophers, scientists, and religious leaders to his court. He asked them questions about governance, astronomy, medicine, theology. He wanted to learn everything. One famous story tells of a Taoist monk named Temüjin who traveled thousands of miles to meet Genghis. Genghis asked him about the secret of immortality. The monk told him there was no such thing, only ways to prolong life through moderation and wisdom. Genghis was disappointed, but respected the honesty. He granted the monk's religious order special protections and exemptions. Genghis was also a military innovator. He constantly refined tactics, adapted new technologies, studied his enemies. After fighting the Chinese, he incorporated siege warfare into his arsenal. After fighting the Persians, he learned new methods of logistics and supply. His army became a learning machine. Every campaign taught new lessons. Every victory was analyzed to understand what worked and what didn't. This continuous adaptation made the Mongols almost impossible to defeat. But Genghis was also getting older. By the early 1220s, he was in his 60s, ancient by the standards of the steppes. He had 4 sons from Berta, Jochi, Chagatai, Ögedei, and Tolui. He also had many other children from various wives and concubines. Succession was a problem. Jochi, the eldest, carried the taint of questionable paternity. Chagatai was fierce but volatile. Ögedei was capable and diplomatic. Tolui was the youngest, brilliant but inexperienced. Genghis chose Ögedei as his successor. This was unconventional. Mongol tradition favored the youngest son inheriting the father's household. But Genghis didn't care about tradition when it conflicted with pragmatism. He believed Ögedei had the temperament to hold the empire together. But before Genghis could retire, one more enemy needed to be dealt with. The Tanguts, a people in western China, had refused to provide troops for the Khwarezmian campaign. This was seen as betrayal. In 1226 AD, Genghis Khan prepared to invade the Tangut kingdom of western Xia. He was now in his mid-60s, old, tired, his body worn down by decades of warfare. But he refused to let the Tangut insult go unanswered. The campaign began well. Mongol forces swept through Tangut territory, capturing cities and fortresses. But during a hunt, Genghis fell from his horse. The injury was serious. Some sources say he developed a fever. Others say internal injuries from the fall began to worsen. His generals urged him to return to Mongolia, to rest and recover. He refused. He continued leading the campaign from his tent, directing strategy while confined to his bed. The Tangut capital, Yinchuan, was besieged. The city held out for months. Genghis grew weaker. He knew he was dying. He called his sons to his bedside. He gave them final instructions. Continue the campaigns, finish what he'd started, hold the empire together. He told them to keep his death secret until the Tangut capital fell. He didn't want enemies to see weakness, didn't want the momentum of the campaign to falter. In August 1227 AD, Genghis Khan died. He was approximately 65 years old. His body was prepared according to Mongol tradition, but the location of his burial remains one of history's great mysteries. According to legend, his funeral procession killed everyone they encountered to keep the burial site secret. Horses trampled the ground to erase any trace of the grave. To this day, no one knows where Genghis Khan is buried. Shortly after his death, the Tangut capital surrendered. Following Genghis's final orders, the Mongols annihilated the Tangut people. The royal family was executed. The cities were burned. The Tangut kingdom ceased to exist. Genghis's legacy was already secure. In just over 20 years, he had transformed the Mongols from scattered tribes into a unified force that controlled most of Asia. He had defeated the Jin dynasty, destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, conquered vast territories in Central Asia. His empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. But the empire didn't end with his death. It expanded. Ogedei Khan, Genghis's third son, took power in 1229 AD. He was a shrewd leader, less brilliant than his father, but more diplomatic. Where Genghis had been a warrior first, Ogedei was an administrator. He continued his father's campaigns, but also focused on consolidating the empire. He built Karakoram into a proper capital, palaces, administrative buildings, storehouses. He formalized tax systems, expanded the Yam postal network, standardized weights and measures. Under Ogedei, the Mongols finished conquering the Jin dynasty. In 1234 AD, the last Jin emperor committed suicide as Mongol forces overran his capital. Northern China was now entirely under Mongol control. But the most dramatic expansion came in the west. Ogedei sent armies under generals Subutai and Batu, Genghis's grandson, into Eastern Europe. In 1237 AD, the Mongols invaded Russia. Russian principalities were divided, weak, unable to coordinate a unified defense. The Mongols tore through them. Moscow burned. Kiev was sacked. Entire populations were slaughtered or enslaved. Chronicles from the time describe rivers running red with blood, fields covered with bodies, cities reduced to empty ruins. The Mongols didn't stop at Russia. They pushed into Poland and Hungary. In 1241 AD, they destroyed a combined Polish-German army at the Battle of Legnica. Shortly after, they annihilated a Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi. Europe was in panic. Nothing seemed capable of stopping the Mongol advance. Western European kingdoms prepared for invasion. The Pope called for crusades. And then the Mongols stopped. News reached the army that Ogedei had died. Mongol law required all princes to return for the election of a new Khan. Batu withdrew his forces from Europe and never returned. Europe had been saved, not by military might, but by political timing. The Mongol Empire continued expanding under subsequent Khans. Mongke Khan, Genghis's grandson, came to power in the 1250s. He sent his brother Hulagu to conquer the Middle East. In 1258 AD, Hulagu's army sacked Baghdad. Baghdad was the heart of the Islamic world, a city of nearly 1 million people, home to the Abbasid Caliphate. The Mongols destroyed it utterly. The caliph was executed. According to legend, he was rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses. The great libraries, rivaling Alexandria in their collection of knowledge, were burned. The Tigris River supposedly ran black with ink from destroyed manuscripts. Estimates of the death toll range from 200,000 to over 1 million. Baghdad would never fully recover. The Mongol advance into the Middle East was finally stopped by the Mamluks, slave soldiers from Egypt. At the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 AD, the Mamluks defeated a Mongol army. It was one of the first significant Mongol defeats. The Mongols never conquered Egypt or North Africa. Meanwhile, in the east, another of Genghis's grandsons, Kublai Khan, was completing the conquest of China. The Song dynasty, which controlled southern China, fell in 1279 AD. For the first time in history, all of China was under foreign rule. Kublai established the Yuan dynasty. He built a new capital, Kambalik, on the site of modern Beijing. He adopted Chinese administrative practices, patronized the arts, welcomed foreign visitors. One of those visitors was Marco Polo, whose accounts would introduce Europe to the wealth and sophistication of the Mongol court. At its height, the Mongol Empire covered over 9 million square miles. It included modern-day Mongolia, China, Russia, Central Asia, parts of the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. It was home to over 100 million people, nearly a quarter of the world's population at the time. But empires built on conquest are inherently unstable. By the late 1200s, the Mongol Empire was fragmenting. Distance, cultural differences, and succession disputes pulled it apart. It split into 4 khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. These khanates sometimes cooperated, sometimes fought each other. The unified vision that Genghis had created slowly dissolved. How do we make sense of Genghis Khan? On one hand, he was responsible for the deaths of millions. Cities were erased, cultures destroyed, entire populations massacred. The scale of violence defies comprehension. On the other hand, the Mongol Empire facilitated unprecedented exchanges of ideas, goods, and technologies. The Silk Road reached its peak under Mongol protection. Knowledge flowed between East and West in ways that hadn't been possible before. Paper and gunpowder, Chinese inventions, spread to Europe through Mongol territories. Printing technology moved westward. Mathematical concepts from the Islamic world reached China. Astronomical instruments, medical texts, agricultural techniques all circulated more freely than ever before. The Mongols were also surprisingly progressive in certain ways. Women in Mongol society had more rights than in most contemporary civilizations. They could own property, participate in political discussions, and even lead armies in rare cases. Berta, Genghis's wife, was a trusted advisor whose counsel he valued throughout his life. The Mongol legal system, despite its harshness, was applied relatively equally. Nobles and commoners faced the same punishments for the same crimes. This was radical in an age when aristocrats routinely escaped consequences through their status. And the religious tolerance the Mongols practiced was genuinely extraordinary. In Europe, religious wars were tearing societies apart. In the Middle East, sectarian conflicts raged. But in the Mongol Empire, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and others coexisted peacefully under a shared legal framework. Historians still debate whether the Mongol conquests were, on balance, beneficial or catastrophic. Some argue that the destruction was so immense it set back human progress by centuries. The obliteration of Baghdad, for instance, ended the Islamic Golden Age. The devastation of Central Asian cities disrupted trade routes and agricultural systems that took generations to rebuild. Others argue that the Mongols created the conditions for the Renaissance. By connecting East and West, they allowed European scholars access to knowledge that had been lost or forgotten. The rediscovery of Greek and Roman texts, preserved in Islamic libraries, was facilitated by Mongol-controlled trade routes. There's truth in both perspectives. The Mongol Empire was simultaneously a force of destruction and a catalyst for progress. It destroyed old orders and created space for new ones. Genghis Khan himself was a bundle of contradictions. He was ruthless, but fair. He massacred populations, but protected freedom of religion. He built an empire through violence, but governed it through law. He was illiterate for most of his life, but recognized the value of knowledge and literacy. He inspired fanatical loyalty in his followers. Men who served under him often remained loyal for life, even those who had once been his enemies. This wasn't just fear. Genghis offered something tangible, a chance to rise, to succeed, to be part of something larger than yourself. In Mongolia today, Genghis Khan is a national hero. His face appears on currency, his name on airports and vodka bottles. He represents Mongolian pride, resilience, and identity. In other parts of the world, he's remembered differently. In Central Asia, he's often seen as a destroyer. In China, he's a complex figure, both a brutal conqueror and the founder of a dynasty that ruled for nearly a century. In the West, he's become almost mythical, a symbol of unstoppable conquest, of brutal efficiency, of the collision between civilization and barbarism. But all of these images miss something essential. Genghis Khan was not a mythical figure. He was a man who made choices, strategic, often brutal choices, shaped by the world he was born into. In 2003 AD, a genetic study made a remarkable discovery. Approximately 16 million men, about 1 in every 200 men alive today, carry a Y chromosome lineage that traces back to a single ancestor who lived around 800 years ago. The most likely candidate? Genghis Khan. This doesn't mean Genghis personally fathered 16 million descendants. It means that his male line descendants, his sons, grandsons, great-grandsons, had many children, and those children had many children, creating an exponential expansion over generations. Why did this happen? Partly because Genghis had many wives and concubines. But more importantly, his descendants held power for centuries across vast territories. Being descended from Genghis Khan gave you legitimacy, status, access to resources. His sons and grandsons ruled kingdoms, commanded armies, married into noble families. This created a feedback loop. Power led to more descendants, which spread the genetic lineage further. Over 25 generations, this compounding effect produced millions of living descendants. It's one of the most dramatic examples of genetic impact from a single individual in human history. Few people have left such a tangible, measurable mark on the human gene pool. But genetics is only one form of legacy. Genghis Khan's impact on history, culture, and geopolitics is far more significant. The Mongol conquests reshaped the political map of Eurasia. Russia's development was profoundly influenced by 2.5 centuries of Mongol rule, the period known as the Mongol yoke. Russian political structures, tax systems, even aspects of military organization were shaped by Mongol models. In China, the Yuan dynasty left lasting impacts on governance, infrastructure, and culture. The Mongols rebuilt Beijing, expanded the Grand Canal, and integrated China into a broader Eurasian trade network. When the Ming dynasty eventually overthrew Mongol rule, they retained many of the administrative systems the Mongols had implemented. In Central Asia, the memory of the Mongol conquests remained vivid for centuries. Timur, also known as Tamerlane, claimed descent from Genghis Khan to legitimize his own conquests in the 14th century. The Mughal Empire, which ruled India for over 300 years, took its name from the word Mongol. The founder, Babur, was a descendant of both Genghis Khan and Timur. The Mongol conquests also had environmental impacts. Some scientists argue that the mass deaths during the conquests, perhaps 40 million people, led to agricultural land reverting to forest. This reforestation absorbed enough carbon dioxide to cause a measurable cooling of global temperatures in the 13th century. If true, it would make the Mongol conquests one of the few human activities in history to have a noticeable impact on global climate. The Mongols also inadvertently facilitated the spread of disease. The Black Death, the plague that killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, likely spread along Mongol trade routes. The same networks that allowed goods and ideas to move freely also allowed pathogens to travel unprecedented distances. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is conceptual. Genghis Khan proved that the world could be unified, that barriers, geographic, cultural, religious, could be overcome through organization, strategy, and will. He created a blueprint for empire that would be studied and emulated for centuries. His meritocratic principles, promoting based on ability rather than birth, would resurface in later revolutionary movements. His emphasis on law, even harsh law, as a unifying force influenced legal systems across Asia. His religious tolerance provided a model, however imperfectly realized, for managing diverse populations. We began with a 9-year-old boy watching his father die. A child abandoned on the steppes, left to starve, written off as irrelevant. That boy refused to accept the world as it was. He learned that survival required ruthlessness, that loyalty was earned, not inherited, that power belonged to those who could take it and hold it. He built alliances through calculation and charisma. He won battles through discipline and innovation. He conquered empires through terror and strategy. And he created something that, for a brief moment in history, unified half the known world. Genghis Khan was not a good man by most moral standards. The suffering he caused was immense, deliberate, calculated. Millions died because he chose conquest over coexistence. But he was also not a mindless destroyer. He built systems that outlasted him. He promoted ideas, meritocracy, religious tolerance, rule of law, that were genuinely progressive for his time. He connected civilizations in ways that facilitated the exchange of knowledge and culture. History doesn't offer simple judgments about figures like Genghis Khan. He was neither hero nor villain, or perhaps he was both simultaneously. He was a product of his world, who then remade that world according to his vision. What's remarkable is not just what he accomplished, though that alone would secure his place in history. What's remarkable is where he started. A boy with nothing became a man who reshaped everything, not through destiny, but through choices made in darkness and hunger, through alliances forged in desperation, through violence so calculated it changed the grammar of warfare itself. The steppes that nearly killed him, that should have killed him, became the foundation of the largest land empire in history. The clan that abandoned him became part of a unified Mongol nation. The enemies who poisoned his father, who captured and humiliated him, were all eventually brought under his rule. 8 centuries later, we still struggle to make sense of him. We still debate whether his legacy is one of destruction or progress. We still find his story both horrifying and compelling. Because ultimately, Genghis Khan's story is about transformation, about what happens when someone refuses to accept their assigned place in the world, about the terrifying truth that individuals can, through will and violence and organization, reshape entire civilizations. The boy who drank muddy water became the Khan who controlled rivers. The child who hunted marmots became the man who commanded hundreds of thousands. The abandoned son became the ancestor of millions. And somewhere, buried in an unmarked grave on the Mongolian steppes, lies the body of the man who proved that the world is never as fixed as it seems. That power can be seized by those willing to pay its price. That empires can rise from nothing if the vision is clear and the will is unbreakable. Temüjin of the Borjigin clan, Genghis Khan, the punishment of God, the architect of empires, the man who changed the world by refusing to accept it as it was. His story began with death on the steppes. It ended with an empire stretching from sea to sea, And in between was everything: survival, vengeance, ambition, conquest, and the relentless drive to transform hunger into power.